15 years I've worked in the marketing and advertising industry in New Motalis. The immense billboards our division have created line the highways, advertising the stark new governmental utopia, which we coined Subterranea. I know a lot about the virtual world and the campaigns, but I've never actually seen any of the facilities. I have no idea how Subterranea operates or functions. I don't really know anything about the production sector or any of the underground offices. The government think tanks conceded that human imagination no longer saw its gods reflected in the cloudy blue sky or up on top of some mountain. And we decided if we were going to refocus humanity on a common theme, the medium of men's dreams was now purely digital, pixelated. It was in these discussions about virtual utopias, digital second lives, and controlled realities that the concept of Subterranea was born. I remember some of the early marketing lines and concept pieces. What if you could merge into a virtual world where anything was possible? And today, this life is just the trial run. Tomorrow, all your dreams will be fulfilled. Don't die, live forever, and transfer your mind to Subterranea. Paradise has come knocking. We knew we'd hit onto something. There was instantly a renewed vigor in the social fabric of urban life. Men were happy once more to work dull blue-collar jobs in factories as they secretly planned their second lives and dreamed about choreographed war and pornography, sex and destruction. That was the paradise men dreamed of, and that was precisely what we promised them. The science, it was all new and theoretic at the start. The idea came first, but the realization of it proceeded slowly and arduously. Nonetheless, when it was announced that the first human mind had been successfully integrated into the Subterranea hardware, there were cheers and celebrations heard across the city. We never really explained in infographics how the transitioning process was done. It was Oswas, the company who manufactured the underground computer system's biggest secret, a closely guarded company, to say the least. Now, I am finally going to see exactly how the transition happens. It's actually kind of exciting. It was my own prerogative to transfer positions. I tell you, I've loved working in marketing, at least in some parts. It was intense and highly stressful, but rewarding. The hours killed me, of course, never knowing weekends or seeing daylight. It was thrilling to see the concepts you created becoming altarpieces all over the city. We were the noise, the fabric, the hope of New Motalis. But it was the pressure that started getting to me, the requirements to deliver constant results. It was a slow burnout. I already have the money saved for a deposit on a large living quarter in the Grand Waterfront Complex on Valsbury Docks. Now I just want something less stressful to play out my twilight years. I feel as though I've earned it. I had tried delivery driving for a while. That had some interesting perks to it. Seeing the curious segments of machinery for various facets of the Subterranea complex was fascinating to me. Immense bionic arm-like contraptions with thousands of sharp hook pincers at the head, those giant metered towers with the cables, the drills, and restraint clips. I would marvel at the objects loaded into my truck on early deliveries. At first, it was quite nice being in a job that dealt more directly with the public too. I found it enlivening how much more chatty those were in the blue-collar sector than in the white-collar. They talked about things other than work, full of laughter and cynicism and sexual innuendo. It made me realize I had never really engaged with the working class before. But as I began chatting back, I found more of a hindrance to cross-class social cohesion than I had imagined. When people learned that I used to work in the marketing divisions, they suddenly seemed to despise me. I was not one of them anymore. Instead, they saw me as a suit or a wanker. They all loved and dreamed of Subterranea, but beyond the basic conception of the utopia that was sold to them, none were interested in how it was created or conceived or maintained, or by whom. Already the working classes viewed Subterranea as their basic human right in life and death for all the hard work they put in across the city. They remained cynical against the government and the white-collar departments. They saw us as cheats, trying to delay them from their rightful paradise, ignoring the fact that we had created the entire thing for them. At first, it was just rude comments that had jarred me. An old lady in Bronzlow Heights had called me a fucking gold-stuffed sack of shit when I delivered her televisual excitement kit to promote her transition into Subterranea. Then, when I was out toward Gondolam Way, a group of truck drivers who had heard about my ex-advertising positions attacked me in a group, kicking me and punching me until I was bruised and battered, curled in a fetal position, knocked my front teeth out, fractured my left hand. I spent a week in the hospital with non-fatal but severe injuries. Finally, I took leave of my delivery routes and transferred again. I figured if anyone was to understand and appreciate the minds who conceptually created Subterranea, it would be the technical staff who maintained the actual database. So I applied to be transferred to the production core in the central vaults beneath New Motalis. It was the marketing sector's idea that the new utopia should be housed underground. We had decided that we needed to turn old stereotypes on their head. The traditional religious ideas about black and white, up and down, pertaining to reward and punishment, made no sense in a scientific, diverse, affirmative worldview. We would champion the underground as a new virtual utopia, start from the bottom and build upwards. Of course, that is where the name Subterranea came from. It also made sense to house the immense machinery and facilities beneath the earth, for they needn't clog up living spaces on the surface, where the living toiled. The company, Oswas, who had taken over most of the operating of the Subterranea system, never released any photography or media showing the facilities themselves. It remained entirely a mystery what was down there, from the public eye, right up to those of us in the government sector, how it worked, even how big the facility was. It was all kept hush-hush. Most government departments agreed it was better this way. Any technical info might ruin the imaginary experience. We constantly released marketing images of virtual landscapes, property that could be bought, single and attractive women sims available to mate with inside the game, and the latest wars and campaigns that were happening within the Afterlife platform. Most of the production is shrouded in mystery. However, everyone at least knows that the Central Oswas head office is located above ground in Chartersfield. That is precisely where I am heading now for my job interview, driving slowly, moving out of the central district with its tall skyscrapers, around the huge steel walls of Zone 1 and towards Western Industria and Chartersfield, along the highway. I will wrap up this vocal recording now. This is the state-issued private electronic journal of Alfred Wilthrow, recording from standard-issued microphone inside my car, updates to follow. On my way back from the Central Oswas facility. The transfer has been approved. I have the job. The whole interview process has left me with a mild unease, and sense of anxiety, mind you. I'm not sure exactly what the cause is. The role seems great, and the pay is highly suitable. It seems I'll be slipping into a kind of management role for a sector of floors in Subterranea. It's curious. I did find some of the questions rather strange, almost as if the recruiters were evaluating my mental preparedness for the role. Have you any experience in war, combat, or other situations which involved intense human trauma? How do you deal with extreme isolation and evidence of others' suffering? Then there were the various psychologists analyzing my past history, prodding and poking into my subconscious mind. I always understood there would be a certain morbidity to working in the underneath. Subterranea was always effectively planned as a modern containment facility for the deceased. It would be impossible with current technologies to integrate human minds into any virtual system without utilizing various existing organs, the brain, the spine, a surrogate heart. I just had no idea that the process would be so hands-on. Describing one of the sectors I would be working in as the killing floor seemed particularly brutal, and that I would be overseeing both the technicians and the laborers, whose roles like the slaughterman, the bone cutter, the organ splicer, the integrator, and the skinning agent all evoked very visceral encounters with the dead. I was thoroughly warned about PPE, personal protective wear, worn on the cutting floor, and the high risks of the job. The interviewers even went so far as to describe past experiences of administration staff having their tendons slashed and dexterities chopped off by accidents involving the sharp knives, bandsaws, and cutting equipment on the killing floor, and other dangers, even more confounding. Cut-resistant gloves, aprons, earmuffs for the constant high-decibel squeals which could cause permanent or temporary hearing loss are just some of the protective gear which must be worn at all times in Sector 18B and 19D. I'm sure I'm just experiencing a natural anxiety associated with lifestyle change. Nothing to worry about. Well, it will all be made quite clear in time, as I start immediately on Monday and will know exactly what the job entails. Until then, I will conclude this recorded journal entry. This is Alfred Winthrow voxing out. Well, I finished my first day in my new management role. The day was interesting. The air was cold and furtive as I arrived, and the facility itself had a drab and atmospheric moroseness. It was the first time I had been further into the facility than the interview rooms, which were above ground. As I arrived, there was a masked guide to transport me to my work quarters. He identified himself as Handler 89. I was led to a locker room and issued with an overcoat, gumboots, sanitary masks, gloves, and hairnet. 89 then proceeded to show me how to hose the blood off my gumboots after we departed the facility and located the staff kitchen, where all food and personal belongings were to be stored. We then proceeded to an elevator, and 89 turned his key in the switchboard, whence after scanning around 199 buttons, he pressed a floor 5/6 toward the lowest of the facility. There was an electronic rattle as the lift shank dropped and the lift began to slowly descend. The journey downwards was intense, taking 3-4 minutes. My stomach began to turn slightly as my guts were vaulted up into my upper body. I began to notice a terribly pungent odor as we reached the lower floors, something like rotten or burning meat, or fecal matter or sulfur mixed with aromatic Middle Eastern herbs. Finally, the lift reached our destination deep within the core of the earth. The doors opened into an extremely high-tech lobby. Handler 89 held the door open and pointed me in the direction of an open steel door. I thanked the masked man and exited the lift. In the appointed room, I found a modest-sized office with a square formation of tables. 2 men wearing ties and formal wear were sitting at the far end. One had a speckled face and glasses, and the other was a tanned Asian man with thick, dark hair. The man with glasses beckoned for me to sit at the adjacent chair, and I moved cautiously to oblige. "Mr. Winthrow, take a seat," he said. "Welcome to Subterranea production facility. But I understand you are one of the minds behind the conception of our brave new world." "I had my part to play," I replied modestly. "But this is where the true genius happens, eh? Any man can dream, but to build?" The pale, brown-haired man adjusted his glasses and raised his black, slanted left eyebrow. "We are in the business of selling dreams, Mr. Winthrow, but actually it's your dream. We have all bought into existence, eh?" He moved his brow suggestively. "There were tens of thousands involved in the initial creation," I said. "I can't be given all the credit." The Asian man wrinkled his brow with an unpleasant scowl. "Yes, one man cannot be responsible for the sins of all the world," he said cryptically. There was an awkward silence until the Asian man reached downwards and retrieved a clipboard, which he then pushed towards me. "We'll get you straight into your position, Mr. Winthrow. Just get you to sign some standardized health and safety agreements." I sensed a vague hostility for the men towards myself, which I couldn't quite place. I signed the forms as quickly as I could, eager to view my workstation. The men finally introduced themselves. The Asian man assured me that, "Mr. Harrison will take you to your workstation now. I'm sure I'll be seeing plenty more of you in coming weeks." The man with the glasses then stood up and led me out of the room. We walked down a long series of corridors. I noticed that the brand new, silver-constructed walls seemed to become more dingy and worn the further into the facility we got. There were dark stains on the lower parts and repetitive scratch marks which suggested long-term applications toward the same task, such as dragging something heavy and metallic repetitively. Finally, the corridor opened into a viewing room of long glass panels through which 50 or more men in protective gear could be seen working, electric sparks and flashing lights filling the background. The men were largely tending to strange alien-looking equipment, removing immense battery-like structures, tinkering with wires and control panels. "You won't be dealing much with this sector," said Mr. Harrison. "These technicians are mainly dealing with the external grid of the facility." "I see," I replied unemotionally. "Just through here," the speckled man said. We trudged through a few more corridors. As we did so, the noise frequency increased, loud drilling sounds, high metallic squeals, and other tools. "We're coming into the yards now. You also won't deal much with this part of the facility, but you may as well see it now. Some find it rather disturbing, but of course it's advised to keep the higher goal in mind here. Elements of the processing can be quite ugly." We approached another control room. Immediately, I perceived the hesitations of Mr. Harrison to describe the area which had been called the yard. It was quite an immense space beyond the safety glass, and within were an irregular amount of human beings, crammed into the space, overcrowded and unhappy-looking. Over 100 haunched and languid bodies. They were an extremely diverse-looking group in terms of race, gender, age, and cultural background. A multitude of skin tones, brown to pastel, washed over the scene. Shorter, wrinkled bodies, tall, fat, stumpy. The men and women were wearing hospital-style gowns and had the look of mental patients. Many were pacing back and forth, some were yelling out obscenities or arguing. Others had their eyes closed and their hands clasped in prayer. All seemed to be filled with a morose dread, and I couldn't look any in their eyes for too long, for fear of catching that strange and infectious terror. "The process of integration can be daunting for some," Mr. Harrison explained. "We are constantly doing our best to improve the relaxation and well-being of the transitioned. This can involve medication, but as you can see, we have on-site psychiatrists to counsel anyone who needs it. During mental breaks, we often will isolate the subjects in our media room, once we are able to show them comforting videos of their families who have recorded their final goodbyes." "It's interesting," I said. "To be honest, none of us in the government sector know much at all about the process of transition." "It's our best-kept secret," Mr. Harrison continued in a guilty tone. "We think it might ruin the positive image of Subterranea to expose the technical processes. And, well, you will know that Oswaz has slowly replaced all the hospitals in the city with transition centers." "That's common knowledge," I replied. Behind the glass, a dark-toned man with black circles beneath his eyes, yellow sores on his cheeks, and horror-filled pupils was screaming and banging the glass. A man wearing medical attire came and escorted the hostile man into one of the back rooms. Mr. Harrison lowered his gaze and continued. "Speaking about transition times or appointments is not legal in New Motalis, but those who have had friends or family who are diagnosed with shortened lifespans or terminal illnesses will already be aware of the bureaucratic elements of the transitioning process. And this is where the processed wind up, I assume," I said. "It is a fairly long process to get here, depending on their medical history." Mr. Harrison spoke on. "They may spend weeks being processed in the surface before they are brought down into the education center. Subjects are only brought down to the processing yards after they have successfully completed their training on the laws, rules, and user control operating systems of Subterranea, and when they have consented and signed all the appropriate documentation." "Yes," I said, growing more and more impatient, curious about the actual process. Mr. Harrison sensed my anxiety, adjusted his glasses, and motioned to the next corridor. "Let's move on to the killing floor now," he said. "As you can see, we do our best to prevent panic at this stage of transition, but there are, mixed and sometimes hostile feelings brought about in the subject, before being integrated sometimes, as can be expected. The change is a big adjustment. I'm afraid this matter only becomes more disturbing as we approach the main transition facilities. Come now. I ask that you try to remember we are doing our best to maintain the mental health and happiness of all our clientele, and that Oswas is constantly evolving and updating the integration process. Please follow me. I was growing skeptical about the constant omens and foreboding warnings of the Oswas staff. But as I moved, my trepidation became more solely focused on those unnerving invasions upon the five senses, increasing volumes of shrieking, multiple varieties, and constant bursts of hot air, and that smell, that decaying methane smell. At the end of the next corridor, Mr. Harrison unbolted several chains on an extremely thick security door. He then gave me a look of suggested preparation, and with a clack, unbolted the final latch and pushed open the immense, groaning steel door. Steamy mist bellowed out of the door. As we came into the next room, I confess, there was instant and natural revulsion which manufactured itself in my stomach. A kind of gargling of bile, a taste of the stench, which made me feel slightly queasy. There were about 4 or 5 humans, naked and on their knees. They had black bags over their heads, and their hands were bound behind their backs. The bodies on the floor were gyrating with all their strength. Shaking and screaming through their Hessian bags, occasional muffled sentences such as, "I've changed my mind," "God damn you," and "No, I don't want to, please stop," were audible. Standing over them, men with hazmat suits, triangular helmets and capes, or horsehead gas masks, held a kind of sharp scythe attached to a rod, which they held upside down. Then, one by one, they inserted the blades into the screaming men's lower back. Unfortunately, as you can see, the subject must remain alive until transformation is complete. There is simply no way around it, said Harrison. We've tried anesthetics of all variety, but the problem is that unless the subject is completely conscious, the mental capacity to adapt is severely limited in the next stage. It does seem rather barbaric, I said, still feeling a little uneasy. As 3 more men were lead in to replace the last, other laborers lifted the now stunned and pierced men up and hung them on one of the bizarre devices I had transported during my time as a delivery driver. Once upon the electric rack, the twitching and screaming only seemed to increase. Mr. Harrison kept leading me into the next room, where we were no longer watching the events through glass, but directly alongside the action. I could already see a vast production line of workers in the next part of the factory, and many human bodies strung along the conveyor belt hooks. Of course, we explained the process in detail to the subjects before we put them through the ordeal, said Mr. Harrison assuringly as we walked onto the killing floor. Most alternate between positive reactions and severe fear and resentment. Therapy works sometimes, but unfortunately there is no alternative to integration at this time. You mean they changed their minds? They don't want to go to paradise? I asked, pained. I was starting to feel very ill, and looking around at the carcasses being mutilated was not aiding me. I watched with unavoidable horror as dozens of laborers with sharp knives and hooks flayed the human bodies upon the conveyor belt, skinning portions at a time. Each worker had their task. The bodies convulsed and kicked and screamed, but the workers continued to cut, deep but non-fatal incisions into the flesh. Exposed muscle and bone revealed unsightly layers of pus and clustered fat. It is almost difficult to describe the gruesome carnage of the killing floor. The stainless steel floors were so thoroughly coated in blood, skin, gore, gristle, and bone. The thick crimson pools encompassed the whole room, and as I looked down, I noticed that my boots were already coated in a vermilion varnish. The reactions are complex and varying, Mr. Harrison said non-convincingly. Here you see the initial transition begins. The beings are not dead yet. I suppose the argument can be made that they do not die at any point of the process. But this is the pivotal moment of fight or flight. See, the slaughterman marks the point of no return. Harrison and I were still walking, following the moving, hanging human bodies. At the exact point in the production line Mr. Harrison was pointing, a rather robust, masked figure holding an immense blade was removing a man's bonds and facial mask. This particular subject was quite sedate and had his eyes closed as he hung upside down. He appeared to be whispering something under his breath repetitively, which resembled Allahu Akbar, the might of the Heavenly Father. The large, muscular, masked figure then proceeded very casually to lower the blade to the other man's face. With one quick swipe, he moved the blade around the man's ear and neck, making a deep incision. Meanwhile, on the other side of the production line, 2 workers were inserting some sort of cables into the base of the man's spine. The passive man began to bleed more profusely as he moved to the next phase in the production line and groan with pain, where I could see that another worker was now gripping the poor fool's facial skin. With latex-gloved fingers and with short tugs, he removed the skin completely from his face, like he was peeling a banana. As the conveyor moved, unfortunately, the next kill was not so passive. The slaughterman removed the next mask, and the man on the rack was screaming intensely. As the executioner untied his hands, the man gave one last attempt to fight back, yelling and trying to grab the executioner around the throat with his veined, skinless, bloody, and muscular arms. "You won't take me alive!" he shrieked. The 2 men behind restrained the man by grabbing him around the throat. Meanwhile, another worker moved in, holding something small and silver in his right hand, which he pressed against the man's neck. "Judas mongrels!" the protester screamed as he was jabbed. There was an electric fuzz, and the man's body jolted before his arms dropped limply to his side, and the whites of his eyes rolled back into his head. The slaughterman, with unbelievable nonchalance, then made the same ritual movement with his blade, and the rebel's facial skin was peeled and removed. Sometimes it is unavoidable that we use a stun gun to keep the process succinct, Mr. Harrison commented with nauseating caution. The workers on the killing floor moved with laborious precision, making the same action every 5 to 10 seconds, all the while sharpening and sanitizing their knives and placing them in and out of their belt scabbards. As we kept following the production lines, the terrible smell became almost unbearable, even through the hygiene mask. I had to move at one point to prevent myself from brushing against a second row of skinned human torsos attached to wires. My shoulders were already coated in blood and little flecks of gore. The next phase in the production actually seemed mildly easier to process than the initial slaughter room. The skinned torsos were now being attached to multiple cables and other machinery. Their muscular faces still groaned and convulsed. However, there was something less immediately confronting about the scene. Men hosed down the blood and pus from the bodies, as others carefully removed organs and intestines, placing these into plastic containers. "We use the human offal to lubricate the machinery," Mr. Harrison asserted almost proudly, stoic about his environmental goals. No sense letting anything go to waste. I noticed that there were more technicians than flesh processors in the next room. There were many strange pieces of equipment and huge screens on the walls. I recognized some of the machinery. Those tall basketball hoop sort of things with the pincers seemed to act as individual receptacles. Each torso eventually, after being hollowed of unnecessary muscle, organ, and bone, was hung on its own receptacle. By this end, each receptacle was then flocked with multiple technicians, 6 or 7 pale blue-clothed men, who began quickly assembling equipment, plugging in wires, soldering and connecting metallic tissue to the brain and spine of the subject. The bloody, sinewy faces were still moaning uncomfortably. Mr. Harrison placed his finger over his mouth, shushing me, and led me towards an adjacent room. Pretty soon we were in a private viewing station. It was only now that I had remotely begun to process what I had been watching. I noticed that my white coat was splattered with blood and gore, and I felt incalculably filthy from the smell and brutality of the killing floor. Mr. Harrison finally lowered his finger. "It's best we don't spend a great deal of time in the transition rooms until you are well acquainted," he said. "We don't want to create any extra paranoia for the subjects. It is a very vulnerable time." Mr. Harrison then lifted something in his hand towards the multiple visual screens in the room and began to flick through channels, bringing up virtual imagery and CGI onion skins on screen. "There are many different roles in the assembly room, and as manager of Sector 18B and 19B, you will be responsible for managing most of them," Mr. Harrison assured me. I nodded, feeling slightly more confident again. This technological environment felt much more familiar and at home to me. This was, after all, what I had signed up for, not to work in a human butcher shop. "I understand," I said. "We will provide full training, of course," Mr. Harrison continued. "It's probably easiest for now if you understand the fundamental division between physical and digital workers. At the very least, a minimal introduction. As you've seen, many of the on-site jobs are highly laborious and physical. OSWAS employs over 12,000 people on-site currently, all of whom reside here and sign confidentiality agreements. There are also off-site workers who work in the virtual sphere." Mr. Harrison clicked a button on his remote, and a virtual CGI space appeared on screen, which resembled a kind of office where two rudimentary polygonal forms were seated. "Many of our digital psychologists work off-site," said Harrison. "We find they work a lot better, being, ignorant of the killing floor and treating that trauma as merely another patient delusion. Successful transition subjects slowly forget elements of their previous life eventually." Mr. Harrison turned up the volume of the monitor, and I could now hear the conversation between the two polygonal forms on screen. It was apparent that the red polygonal body was the psychologist, and that he was talking to the other polygonal shape with comforting aphorisms, who I gathered was one of the recently transitioned subjects. My attention was drawn to the myriad other screens on the far wall, where images of gore, torture, violence, fire, and chaos were abundant. "Yes, said Mr. Harrison as his eyes bulged through his glass frames, acknowledging my gaze. "There's no sense in beating around the bush. I'll show you the nightmare contingent." "The nightmare contingent?" I asked with fear. Mr. Harrison used his control to cycle the imagery on the small screens onto the large display screen. The images shocked me, not merely for their grotesqueness, but for their surreal nature. Flocks of humanoid geese restraining a cyclonic caterpillar, sucking out green juice with straws, a slaughterhouse of horned bull and cow people whipping human beings with many-tailed and hooked whips, decapitated eyeballs floating in Japanese ramen bowls, a little girl being eaten by a green, bony giant. The nightmares were too boundless and insane to relay. "Yes," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his glasses guiltily. "One of the early problems we encountered with the virtual containment of the human mind was the portioning of certain realities. At first we presumed there was merely a basic duality between the mind's awareness of its original physical limitations, the hanging torso in the assembly room, and the virtual avatar which we controlled in the world of Subterranea. Well, you know what they say. You should never assume. It makes an ass out of you and me," I remarked nervously. "Yes. Well, it took a long time to isolate what visual pattern the physical bodies were screaming about, which was evidently separate from the mental avatar. We had to scour dimensional space with our ultraviolet scanners before we found the other spaces." "The other spaces?" "They were almost subatomic, invisible, but then we found that the brain created consistent visuals in processing with human emotion. These nightmares dwell in the recesses of all human minds." "They can't be extracted?" I asked, horrified. "Thus far, we've had some success with the therapy in minimizing the nightmares. But unfortunately, as it stands, the entire ratio of pleasurable experiences within the virtual worlds of Subterranea and the nightmares is... well, it's about 99 to 1. 1% of the transitive are living a total nightmare, I asked in horror. Mr. Harrison turned off many of the surrounding screens, switching over to a display of more safe virtual imagery of characters' avatars exploring the virtual world of Subterranea. "You have misunderstood me, I'm afraid," he said at last. "As it stands, the nightmare contingent is currently at 99%. I was very quiet in the lift. Another masked man named Handler 42 escorted me to the surface later that afternoon. I don't think I really processed what I had witnessed that day until outside the facility. The combination of the smell, the returning visceral imagery of human carrion, muscle and cartilage being sliced, the screaming human beings in the yards, and the nightmarish imagery on the computer monitors in the assembly rooms. Oh God, that stench! I vomited on the asphalt next to my car, chundering up large portions of my lunch. My stomach still hasn't settled, and the taste... I think that's enough journal for today. This is Alfred Winthrow. It's been a long time since I've had the stomach to make a journal. I don't think I can take another day on the killing floor. I was supposed to turn up for a shift today, but my body physically restrains me from going. Oh God, the abysmal horror of it. It's monstrous. The public have no idea what lies beneath, no idea what horrors man has brought upon himself. It was Zhou, the Asian man who finally revealed the truth to me. At last I understood his resentment, the deeply buried hate he and the other managers held for me, and the other conceptual marketers who came up with the idea of Subterranea. They blame us for conceiving of the idea which has turned into such a foul abomination, such a living hell. Joe came to me with soft reluctance into my office. He knew that I was growing more and more hopeless by the day. I was clutching my head in my hands as he entered. He knew that it was getting on top of me, eclipsing me, devouring me. "There's no way to fix it, is there?" he said to me, immediately confrontational. I said nothing. "Come with me," he said coldly. "I have to show you something." It was a long journey down the lifts to the lowest level of Subterranea, the most inner core. I felt that contained sickness in my guts as I followed Joe, trying to sedate my curiosity. "What's down here anyway?" I finally asked, unable to suppress my urges any longer. When the drilling company first begun to hollow out this facility, this was the deepest they reached. The original plan was to build the facility at a precise size, about 10 kilometers deeper than the ground floor. "Why did they stop?" I pressed, curious but also terrified, not wanting to know. The lift approached the bottom floor. Many of the construction workers doing the dig displayed all kind of physical abnormalities and mental illness from working down here. They thought it was the pressure or lack of oxygen or an unknown chemical leak. The men all started having daylight hallucinations, perpetual nightmares that didn't abate. Nightmares of torture, human beings held captive by abhorrent alien life forms. Unfathomable misshapen things, writhing tentacled gelatinous thought forms. Liquid, pimpled, vegetable-like, textured things which couldn't be called living by any scale of our imagination. The lift doors opened, and we walked into a very simple silver floor, of metal, with immense screens or windows running along the walls. I no longer need to imagine the oddly described monsters of Zhou's narrative. I could now see them clearly through the televisual screens abounding the walls. Their monstrosity, however, defied even Zhou's words. The nightmarish things in those screens were so beyond description, I could translate them only as pure nightmare. A fibrous void of interconnected ropey, stringy brown flesh, rat-like things crawling over the top of zombie bears, goblin beings devouring human flesh, immense platforms of eyeballs and screaming pixie children. None of these things were separate entities. The all was the one, and the one the all. The thing writhed and shook, fluctuating and metamorphosing into nothingness and the absolute organism of decay, a black hole of organic matter. Zhou wiped sweat from his face. The heat in the basement core was intense, logical given that we were much closer to the flaming center of the Earth. When we tried to locate the dimensional source of the nightmare contingent, we isolated the frequency and found it grew deeper retrospectively to the Earth's core. It was mathematical. Human nightmare was algorithmically related to gravity and heat. It's been in our biology since we were cavemen. Zhou stated matter-of-factly. I stared at the amorphous mass of living tissue through the viewing station. The more I gazed at it, the more I felt it became a kind of psychedelic magic eye puzzle. My eyeballs watered and shimmered so that it almost hurt to look at it, like staring at the center of the sun. Within, my mind came hallucinationary forms, as if this hypercolored void was the very essence of dream, like I was staring at the machination of my own subconscious mind, the innermost core of nightmare. The men who came down here didn't develop psychological illnesses like some infection. They dug beneath their own subconscious. "What the hell are you talking about?" I stammered, flustered and annoyed by rage. "That makes no sense whatsoever." As Zhou led me further along the steel basement, the amorphous liquid shapes outside the windows began to breathe and vibrate, oozing colors beyond our spectrum. Zhou pointed ahead where something was marked in the far wall. "Don't you see?" Zhou exclaimed with anger. "The decision to burrow into man's subconscious created an abyss. You people did this. Subterranea is not a virtual paradise. It's a means through which humanity has unwittingly opened a gateway to its depthless taboos, its endless caverns of fear. It's the mirror we can't bear to look at. We haven't conquered death. We've trapped ourselves in a nightmare we can't wake up from. Take a look for yourself." Zhou now pointed towards the back wall, where I could make out a red-painted door set strangely in the steel. I looked back at Zhou, who ushered me on, morosely. I walked heedfully onwards, feeling at the dawn of some new, extremely indescribable and unfathomable horror beyond all conception in Earth's history. Opened the red door into a square space. I remember the feeling of walking into a dream, that void, that writhing mass of unconscious flesh beneath us all. It was as though the membrane of life had been severed and the chasm of horror beneath gurgled up like unchecked sewerage. A flood of nightmares consumed me. Then I awoke, in my soft bed, in the waterfront complex on Valsbury Docks. That was this morning. Today. So perhaps you can understand my disinclination to turn up to work. Oh, the secrets I now harbor. The revelations that I learned beneath the subconscious membrane. Oh, citizens, if you only knew. The tortured and mangled, they are the true forms we deny ourselves. We are the residents of Subterranea, and this mundane life is the minuscule dream which we whisper unscrupulous to ourselves, in the vain hope we may believe that we are not already damned, beneath and inside the scolding core of the collective mind. We are the lost and damned souls, trapped forever in the vaults of Subterranea.